Okay, in this video we're just going to be doing a little bit of revision, looking at why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards and the various components within the aggregate demand curve, and some tricks to think about when looking at these different components. So aggregate demand is the total demand for Australian-made, locally produced goods and services. And when we're talking about aggregate demand for Australian goods and services, we're looking at only final goods, so not intermediate goods, at any given time and price level. So total demand for Australian-made, locally produced goods and services. And aggregate demand is important because, well, if nobody wants to demand our goods and services, there's no real point in supplying them. So higher aggregate demand provides the incentives for production, provides the incentives for firms to produce goods and services. And then with that production, that helps to generate income, generate growth, generate future expenditure for our economy. So without aggregate demand for our products, there won't be any production of goods and services, and therefore it won't help to boost our material living standards. So reasons why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. So why at higher prices there will be a lower aggregate demand. The first one is the purchasing power effect. Basically, to sum up, at higher prices, like the affordability effect, we can't buy as much if prices are higher. So at higher prices, consumers cannot afford as many Australian goods and services, and therefore real GDP will be lower. So at lower prices, consumers have increased purchasing power and therefore are able to demand a greater level of goods and services. And secondly, if our prices are lower, well, people overseas want to buy our stuff. It's like the substitution effect. If products in Australia are cheaper, then overseas people are going to buy our exports, and again, there'll be a greater volume of goods and services demanded of Australian goods and services. So the second effect that is that lower aggregate prices improves our international competitiveness and therefore will boost our exports, and we know that's a component of aggregate demand, and that will help to boost our real GDP. There are two other effects. There's the wealth effect and the interest and exchange rate effect. Just really briefly, the wealth effect basically says that when inflation's really high, people, their house prices aren't worth as much, so they generally don't buy as many products. And the second one we'll learn a lot more in detail later on in the year, but basically when inflation's high in Australia, interest rates rise, and when interest rates rise, the Australian dollar appreciates, and when the Australian dollar appreciates, people don't want to buy our products from overseas because they're too expensive. So basically, that's the interest rate. That's the interest rate channel. Is that when prices in Australia are high, we have inflation. Interest rates rise. When interest rates rise, the exchange rate rises because essentially people want to put money in our banks, people overseas, and then flowing on from that, when the exchange rate rises, people don't demand Australian goods and services because they're too expensive. But we will learn that later on. Note that prices changes do not shift the aggregate demand curve. If price changes, it's not shifting the curve, it's moving up and down the curve, like with microeconomics. It's very important. So things that will shift the curve, weaker demand side conditions will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, and stronger demand side conditions will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So these are instances other than price that are going to cause an impact on our demand and real GDP. So that would be things like if consumer confidence was to increase, or interest rates were lower, or we lowered taxes. All of these things would boost demand to the right, and we'll learn about those in Chapter 5. But basically, the aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between price on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis, not nominal GDP, real GDP. The higher the aggregate demand, assuming we have spare supply, the increase in production that will occur because people want to buy our products, so we'll produce more, and that will lead to an increase in our real GDP. So higher aggregate demand leads to higher real GDP, assuming the economy has spare capacity, assuming we're able to meet that extra demand with extra supply. And here are some factors that are basically going to shift the aggregate demand curve, and we're going to learn about these in Chapter 5. But it's really important that you get the understanding now that these factors are either going to move the aggregate demand curve left or right. So it's going to move to the left and lower real GDP, or move to the right and increase real GDP. And that's the relationship that's really important now we get into macroeconomics, explaining the relationship between all of these in aggregate demand and all of these in future real GDP. Okay, the formula for aggregate demand is C plus I plus G1 plus G2 plus X minus M, and I'm going to talk about that in the next video.